It's a sound that splits a life in two, the sharp, thin tear of an envelope. In a cramped apartment that always smelled faintly of bleach and fried onions, that sound was a gunshot, a starting pistol, a verdict. Maria's hands, raw and chapped from 1,000 sinks and 1,000 steering wheels, trembled so badly she could barely unfold the single, heavy stock paper. Her daughter, Elena, stood beside her, vibrating with a silence so total it felt louder than a scream. And then the word. Just one, really, that mattered. Congratulations. Maria's legs gave out, and she didn't fall so much as melt onto the worn linoleum, the letter clutched to the faded fabric of her diner uniform. Harvard. The name itself felt like a foreign word in this room, a place of red brick and presidents, a world away from the 4 a.m. alarms and the ache that lived permanently in her bones. This single piece of paper wasn't just an acceptance, it was a receipt. It was the itemized proof of a debt paid in exhaustion, in missed moments, in a currency of relentless, backbreaking, soul-crushing work. For Maria, the journey to this moment hadn't started with college applications. It had started 18 years ago with a different piece of paper, a birth certificate, and a promise whispered to a tiny, sleeping infant. You will have more. This promise was the engine that drove her, the fuel she burned when everything else ran empty. And everything else, it seemed, was always running empty. Maria's life was a puzzle, its pieces scattered across 3 different schedules, 3 different uniforms, 3 different versions of herself. The first Maria woke at 4 a.m., the city still cloaked in an indifferent blue. This was Diner Maria. She tied her hair back in a tight bun, slipped on her orthopedic shoes, the most expensive things she owned, and walked to the bus stop in the dark. For 6 hours, she was a whirlwind of motion and manufactured smiles. She poured coffee for truckers who didn't see her, cleared plates for businessmen discussing deals worth more than her annual income, and navigated the sticky floors with a practiced grace. She knew regulars by their orders, not their names. A number 3, eggs over easy, or a black coffee side of toast. She was background noise, a functioning part of the scenery, and every coin that hit the tip jar was a tiny, metallic chime counting down toward Elena's future. She'd finish at 11 a.m., her apron stained with ketchup and coffee, her pockets heavy with change, and walk 10 blocks to her second self. This was Janitor Maria. This Maria was silent, solitary. She traded the clatter of the diner for the hollow hum of a fluorescent-lit office building, emptied in the post-lunch lull. Her tools were a mop, a spray bottle of blue liquid, and a profound sense of invisibility. She cleaned the glass walls of conference rooms where decisions were made that she would only ever feel the ripple of. She scrubbed toilets, used by people who would never know her name, who left footprints she was paid to erase. This job was the quietest, but in many ways the hardest. It was 4 hours of confronting what she wasn't, of being reminded of the world Elena was fighting to enter, a world that, for now, Maria could only tidy up after. By 3:30 p.m., she was back in their apartment, just in time for Elena to walk through the door, her backpack overflowing with textbooks that Maria couldn't understand but paid for one shift at a time. They had 90 minutes together. This was the sacred time. In this tiny window, they weren't the poor, struggling family. They were just mom and daughter. They'd sit at the wobbly kitchen table, Maria nursing her aching feet while Elena, a force of focused energy, tackled calculus or chemistry. Maria would listen, nodding, her mind a fog of fatigue, but her presence was non-negotiable. She'd ask questions. What does that X mean again? Not because she needed to know, but because Elena needed to be heard. This 90-minute ritual was the heart of their entire operation. It was the why. It was the reminder that the diner grease and the smell of disinfectant were temporary, but Elena's mind, her potential, was permanent. They'd share a quick meal, often pasta with butter or scrambled eggs, cheap protein to fuel a growing brain and a weary body, and then, as the sun began to dip, Maria would transform a final time. She'd put on a clean shirt, grab her keys, and become Driver Maria. From 5 p.m. until well after midnight, her tiny, 10-year-old sedan became her office. The city she had served and cleaned all day now became a grid of fares. She ferried laughing college students from bars, silent couples to fancy restaurants, and weary travelers to the airport. In the driver's seat, she was a ghost again, a means to an end. She'd listened to the podcasts and audiobooks Elena downloaded for her, trying to absorb fragments of the world her daughter was so desperate to join. She'd park under a streetlight at 1 a.m., counting the crumpled bills, her eyes burning. She'd drive home, climb the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, and find Elena asleep at the kitchen table, her face pillowed on an open history book. Maria would gently lift her, carry her to her bed, and then sit for just a moment, watching her daughter sleep. She checked the locks, set the alarm for 4 a.m., and fall into bed for a precious, brutal, and entirely insufficient 3 hours of sleep. Then, she would do it all over again. This was the rhythm of their lives, a punishing drumbeat of survival. Weekends didn't exist. Holidays were just opportunities for double-time shifts. Sickness was a luxury they couldn't afford. There were moments, of course, when the machinery threatened to break down. The time the car's transmission failed, wiping out the Harvard jar, a repurposed pickle jar filled with folded bills, in a single afternoon. Maria had sat in the mechanic's plastic chair and cried, a silent, racking sob of pure despair. It was the first time Elena had seen her truly break. Elena, then 16, hadn't cried with her. She had simply taken her mother's hand, her own grip surprisingly strong, and said, "It's okay, Mom. I'll get a job. We'll fix it." And she did. Elena started tutoring younger kids, adding her small earnings to the new jar. It was no longer just Maria's sacrifice. It was a shared burden, a partnership forged in the fires of necessity. Elena became a warrior in her own right. She was the girl who never went to parties, who wore the same 2 pairs of jeans until they were threadbare, who ate her lunch in the library to get extra study time. She understood the weight of every dollar, the cost of every hour. When her classmates complained about their allowances or their curfews, Elena would just nod, her mind on the periodic table or the nuances of the Treaty of Versailles. She wasn't just working for an A. She was working for her mother's future as much as her own. She was fighting for a day when Maria's hands could finally rest. The application process itself was a mountain. It wasn't just the academics, it was the audacity. It was a girl from a zip code that colleges overlooked, a girl whose mother signed her forms with a hand stiff from manual labor, daring to ask for a seat at the most exclusive table in the world. The application fees alone were the equivalent of a full weekend of driving. The guidance counselor at Elena's underfunded public school, a well-meaning but exhausted woman, had gently suggested more realistic options. "A state school would be a wonderful achievement, Elena," she had said. "Harvard as well, it's a reach for anyone." Maria had been in that meeting, sitting straight-backed in her diner uniform between shifts. She had listened quietly, and then, in a voice that was low but held the unbending strength of steel, she said, "My daughter will apply. You tell us what forms we need. We will handle the rest." She had looked at the counselor, her gaze unwavering, and for a second, the tired waitress was gone, replaced by a queen defending her heir. The counselor, taken aback by the quiet ferocity, simply printed the forms. That night, Maria took an extra shift, driving until the sun came up, just to cover the cost of sending the applications. Then came the essays. Elena struggled for weeks, trying to find the perfect story. She wrote drafts about community service, about her academic passions, about leadership. They all felt flat, dishonest. Maria found her one night, past midnight, weeping over her laptop. "I don't have anything to write about, Mom," she whispered, defeated. "I haven't built houses in a foreign country. I haven't started a nonprofit. All I've done is this. Just survive." Maria sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning in protest. She looked at her daughter, this brilliant, beautiful girl who thought her own life was uninteresting. "Elena," she said, her voice rough with fatigue, "don't you dare write about what you think they want to hear. Don't you dare hide who you are. Your survival. That is the story. The fact that you are sitting here, right now, aiming for a place like that after everything, that is a miracle. You write about the kitchen table. You write about the sound of my alarm in the dark. You write about how you studied in the car while I drove strangers. You write your truth. If they're smart enough to be Harvard, they'll be smart enough to see you." And so Elena did. She deleted her sterile drafts and she started over. She wrote about the smell of bleach on her mother's hands. She wrote about the dignity of work, about the quiet heroism of the invisible. She wrote about how the hum of the floor buffer in an empty office building at midnight was the soundtrack to her dreams. She wrote about her mother, not as a victim, but as the single most powerful, resilient, and brilliant person she had ever known. She poured their entire life, their struggle, their partnership, onto those pages. She sealed the envelope, and they sent their truth off to a brick building in Massachusetts. The waiting was a special kind of torture. It was a silent, anxious hum beneath the daily noise of the diner and the drone of the car engine. Life went on. Bills had to be paid. Shifts had to be worked. But now there was this new, fragile thing in the air. Hope. It was almost more painful than the struggle itself. Hope meant there was something to lose. Maria found herself praying, not to any specific god, but to the abstract forces of the universe, bargaining with her own exhaustion. Just let her have this, she'd think, scrubbing a stubborn stain at 2 a.m. I can do another 10 years of this. I can do 20. Just let her go. She became superstitious. She'd count the number of red cars on her way to the diner. She'd wear the same pair of socks on Fridays. Anything to feel a sliver of control over a process that was now completely, terrifyingly out of their hands. Elena, for her part, threw herself into her schoolwork with a renewed fever, as if she could retroactively earn her spot, as if her final grades in her last semester could somehow reach back in time and influence the decision-makers. They barely spoke of it, referring to it only as the letter or the email. The unspoken possibility hung between them at their 90-minute table meetings, a ghost guest at their humble dinners. And then the day came. It was a Tuesday. Maria had just gotten home from the diner, the smell of bacon grease clinging to her, and was about to change into her cleaning uniform. Elena was home early, her school having a half day. The mail was on the table, a small stack of junk and bills. And in the middle, one thick, crimson envelope. It had no return address, just the unmistakable crest. They both saw it at the same time. Neither of them moved. It was Elena who finally reached for it, her hand shaking. "It's thick," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They say thick is good." Maria just nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs, so hard she felt dizzy. "Open it, Mija," she breathed. Elena tore the envelope, the sound that split their world in two. She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning, until they found the word. Congratulations. It was Maria who screamed first, a sound of such raw, primal release that it seemed to shake the very walls of the apartment, a sound that carried 18 years of exhaustion, fear and ferocious, unyielding love. Elena just crumpled, weeping into her hands, as Maria pulled her into an embrace, the two of them sinking to the floor, laughing and crying, the letter pressed between them. This piece of paper wasn't an acceptance to a college. It was an emancipation. It was the key to a different life, a life where sleep wasn't a luxury and dignity wasn't something you had to fight for every single day. The weeks that followed were a blur of forms, financial aid applications, and a new kind of exhaustion, the logistics of the impossible. The tuition, even with a generous scholarship, was staggering. The remaining amount was a number so large it felt fictional. But Maria, now armed with a tangible goal, was a force of nature. She took on extra shifts, drove until her vision blurred, sold the few pieces of jewelry she had, and fundraised with her church. The community, seeing the single mother who had moved heaven and earth, rallied. The other waitresses at the diner pooled their tips. The regulars she had served for years, the ones she thought never even saw her, slipped $100 bills into her hand. The superintendent of the building she cleaned offered a month's free rent. It was a patchwork quilt of support, small kindnesses sewn together to bridge the gap. They were no longer invisible. Their struggle, and now their triumph, had made them seen. Elena, meanwhile, was terrified. The imposter syndrome was overwhelming. She was a girl who ate buttered noodles for dinner, and she was going to be sitting next to kids who vacationed in Europe, kids whose parents were the people Maria cleaned up after. "What if I'm not smart enough, Mom?" she confessed one night, her voice small. "What if I get there, and they all realize I'm a fraud?" Maria, who was packing a newly bought suitcase, a gift from the diner staff, stopped folding. She turned to her daughter and held her face in her hands. "Listen to me, Elena. You are not a fraud. You are a miracle. You earned this with your mind, and I earned this with my back. You are going to go there, and you are going to be scared, and you are going to be lonely, and you are going to feel like you don't belong. And that's okay. But you will never be outworked. You know what it costs. They don't. That is your power. You walk onto that campus, and you hold your head high because you are the product of a love that is stronger than any trust fund. The day they left for the airport was the first day in 18 years that Maria had not gone to work. Her bosses at all 3 jobs had insisted. She stood in the security line, her heart a tangled mess of pride and terror. She was letting go of her entire world. Elena, looking impossibly small and impossibly grown up with her new backpack, kept looking back, her eyes bright with unshed tears. When they called Elena's boarding group, Maria hugged her daughter so tightly she thought she might crack a rib. Work hard, she whispered into her hair. But be happy. Please, Mija, be happy. Call me. Don't forget to eat. Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face. I love you, Mom. Thank you. Thank you for everything. And then, she was gone, walking down the jet bridge, not looking back. Maria stood at the window, watching the plane taxi and take off, until it was just a silver speck disappearing into the clouds. She stayed there for a long time, long after the plane was gone. Then, she turned, walked out of the airport, and got on the bus. She had a shift to pick up, but something was different. The ache in her feet was still there, the bus still smelled like exhaust, but the crushing weight on her shoulders, the weight she had carried for nearly 2 decades, was gone. It had flown away, headed northeast, to a place of red brick and possibilities. The first few months were hard. Elena's phone calls were filled with a mix of awe and anxiety. She talked about the libraries, the size of the dining hall, the brilliance of her professors. But she also talked about the loneliness, the casual wealth of her classmates, the feeling of being a step behind. Maria listened. She didn't offer solutions, she just listened. She was her anchor, the voice on the other end of the line reminding her who she was. You belong there, she'd say, over and over, standing in the pre-dawn cold at her bus stop. You belong. Meanwhile, Maria's life had changed, even as it stayed the same. She still worked the 3 jobs, but the desperation was gone. She was no longer running from the fire, she was simply paying the bills. She had a new item on her tiny budget, a savings account for a plane ticket to parents' weekend. The Harvard jar was now the Visit Elena jar. Her coworkers asked about her daughter constantly. How's our girl? The cook at the diner would yell. She acing all her tests. Maria would smile, a real, genuine smile, and say, she's working hard. She's happy. That spring, Maria flew on a plane for the first time in her life. She used her 1 week of paid vacation, an accumulation of 5 years at the diner, and flew to Boston. She walked onto the Harvard campus, her cheap suitcase rattling on the ancient cobblestones. She looked up at the buildings, the ivy, the sheer weight of history, and she wasn't intimidated. She felt a sense of ownership. Her sweat was in these bricks. Her lost sleep was in the manicured lawns. Elena came running, tackling her in a hug, no longer the scared girl from the airport, but a confident young woman, her vocabulary different, her posture straighter. Elena gave her the tour, pointing out her dorm, her classrooms, the library where she spent her nights. She introduced Maria to her friends, to her professors, with a pride that made Maria's chest ache. That evening, Elena took her mother to a formal dinner. Maria wore her best church dress, feeling out of place among the suits and pearls. But Elena held her hand, her grip as strong as it had been the day the transmission broke. As they sat listening to a speech by a famous dean, Elena leaned over and whispered, They're all looking at you, Mom. Maria tensed. Why? Is something wrong with my dress? Elena laughed, a bright, clear sound. No, Mom. They're looking at you, because I told them my story. I told them all about you. They think you're a hero. Maria looked at her daughter, this brilliant stranger who was still her baby, and for the first time, she truly understood. The goal had never been Harvard. Harvard was just the destination. The journey, the work, the sacrifice, that was the point. It was the forging of a bond, the proving of a promise. It was a single mother, armed with nothing but love and a mop, staring down a world designed to keep her out, and winning. As she sat in that hallowed hall, surrounded by a level of privilege she could barely comprehend, Maria, the waitress, The cleaner, the driver, finally allowed herself to believe it. She was a hero! And her daughter, her brilliant, Harvard-educated daughter, was her masterpiece.